All right, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast, BBOR, Black Box Online Radio. Today we're talking about the 1966 murder of Cheri Jo Bates from Riverside, California. Cheri Jo was born Cheri Josephine Bates, commonly known to the world as Cheri Jo, and she was murdered outside the Riverside City College Library on October 30th, 1966. Her body was found on October 31st, Halloween morning at around 6:30 a.m. on Halloween, of course, 1966. Now, this, of course, is something that I've been wanting to do for a while. I mentioned on one of the previous uploads that we did about kind of wanting to do a deep dive podcast segment in the past, and we were doing the Occult Mondays feature here on BBOR. But one of the things that I had been toying about was doing sort of something larger about Cheri Jo Bates to really try and get some answers. I kind of made the initial statement that I wasn't going to be doing a murder case for the deep dive podcast, so we ended up doing Occult Mondays for a couple months. But I mean, Cheri Jo Bates is a case that has always fascinated me because people can't even make up their minds, is this Zodiac or is this not? What I would say about this case is that we're dealing with a lot of things that are going back to the 1960s, and there are conflicting reports amongst everything. I mean, like, you can find that the time of death for Cheri Jo Bates was around 12:30 at night, but then this very nice presentation that was done by Zodiac Killer Identified was actually saying that the time of death actually occurred between 9:07 and 9:30 on October 30th. And it's just like you find loads of things like that with Cheri Jo Bates about how her body would have been here, her body would have been there. And we also have a confession. Like, somebody contacted the newspapers and they were trying to say that they were responsible for the murder of Cheri Jo Bates. And I was on the website zodiacciphers.com. In the past, I've talked about zodiacciphers.net. I'm not sure if they're connected, but I'm pretty sure that these were different sites. Zodiacciphers.com did a very big piece about Cheri Jo Bates. And they were talking about how someone confessed to the murder, but the forensic info did not support their case at all. Like, and that relates to where the body was found and the trail of blood. They were giving incorrect statements about where the blood would have been, and person walking this way or that would have left, a trail of blood in these places. What does that mean? Does that mean that people are just toying with the police? Because we've heard that before on Zodiac uploads. I mean, when I was doing my original uploads about Richard Gaikowski and the Lyndon Lafferty theory and Louis Myers, people were leaving in comments and they're saying, what about the possibility that people are messing with the police, that they are sending false information, that they are, in short, trolling the police by giving, these false leads or false confessions, fabricating letters in the name of somebody else, in the name of a murderer? Is that what we're seeing with the case of Cheri Jo Bates? Well, what happened was, on October 30th, Cheri Jo Bates was studying at the Riverside City College Library, and what she did was she went out to her car, a Volkswagen Bug, and the car wouldn't start. Someone had tampered with the car, so they weren't able to start. I believe the passenger window was actually rolled down a little, so that kind of gives us the impression that someone kind of knocks on the passenger window, and then they're sort of like, hey, are you having some car trouble? Well, I can give you a lift home. Now, Cheri Jo goes with this individual, and that leads to her demise. From a few things we've talked about on this channel, Ross Sullivan, one of the prime suspects in the Zodiac killer case, as well as the prime suspect in the murder of Cheri Jo Bates, drove a Volkswagen Bug as well. Would he have known how to tamper with the thing? If I recall, like, what they've actually kind of said, I mean, the way that the car was tampered was the ignition was turned on, so the battery went dead, and that's actually what happened. And because I believe there was something about how the ignition was even sort of found like kind of in the on position, although I'm a little hazy on that specific detail. Is the point is the car would not start, and someone's kind of knocking on the passenger window, and that's given a lot of people the sort of premise, the sort of feeling, the idea that Cheri Jo Bates was very familiar with her attacker. Is that true? Well, On the first ever thing that pulled me into the Zodiac cases was an interview with Lyndon Lafferty. We've talked about Lyndon Lafferty and his potential suspect, George Russell Tucker, here on this channel before. And Lyndon Lafferty was saying about the Zodiac is that he has a person that he believes was the Zodiac killer. And what he said was, this is the type of guy that would be able to get somebody to give you a ride in his car even if they didn't know him. Like he just sort of had that sort of persuasive ability to pull people in. And we've mentioned that we do find this very frequently with murderers. I mentioned Moses Sotole from South Africa, Fred West from England. They had that sort of persuasive ability to make people kind of go along with them. And then when we want to talk about this, I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that Lyndon Lafferty is correct and George Russell Tucker was the Zodiac killer. But the whole point is, Cheri Jo Bates did not necessarily have to know her attacker. She did not necessarily have to be acquainted with him. Is this just sort of like a pattern and psychological trait that sort of goes on where the person is very persuasive, the person who knocks on your window, oh, are you having car trouble? Well, why don't I give you a lift? That they're sort of putting people in that false sense of security. I repeat, she does not necessarily have to know her attacker. But the thing that we also need to bear in mind is that there is physical evidence left behind with the murder of Cheri Jo Bates. We have a wristband from a watch that was about 7 inches long. We have hair that was pulled out from Cheri Jo Bates during her struggle. And while I was reading the details about the murder of Cheri Jo, I would say that it is something that is very, very gruesome. And I felt kind of sickened when I was reading the details about how brutally she was attacked. But there's an enormous amount of physical evidence. I mean, we're going to be talking about a watch that should be loaded with fingerprints, not to mention all kinds of DNA that would be things like if she was able to pull out the perpetrator's hair. I mean, it sounds like there's an enormous amount of physical evidence that was left behind, and it's quite shocking that after all this time, an arrest wasn't made or more potential suspects wouldn't have been identified. But when we want to look at some of the things about the murder, we can't go very far without mentioning the Riverside desk poem. Someone wrote a very gruesome poem about in the Riverside City College Library, which Ross Sullivan did work at. Ross Sullivan was very frequently in the library. This was carved into a desk, and it details the kind of horrific acts. I haven't completely memorized it. I mean, there's some things there like her blood will spill, her blood will be, she'll be cut clean. Thankfully, she's wearing a red dress, so when she's bleeding on it and stuff like that. And I'm not really quoting the poem, just those are the things that they are talking about in it. That some girl is going to get cut, she's going to be bleeding. Cheri Jo Bates was actually wearing red pants at the time, and I don't know if that's just a coincidence or not. But the point is, there's this poem that's talking about cutting up a girl who's wearing a red dress, and they're talking about stabbing her, as well as Cheri Jo was also slashed across the face. Now, what we have to say about this is, someone left a comment on one of the Zodiac websites, and they were saying that what is the coincidence that someone carves a poem into the desk and just says some very gruesome things about attacking a woman with a knife, and then that actually happens? Like, is that actually a coincidence? Is there any chance that the perpetrator in the murder of Cheri Jo Bates did not write that poem? Did not, I mean, you can't even really call it a poem, just did not write those, that sort of immediate threat of violence. Is there any chance? I think that's very unlikely that the perpetrator in the murder of Cheri Jo Bates did not write that poem. I think that definitely came from the murderer. However, though, once again, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if anything's pretty much possible, but I wouldn't be surprised if someone were to provide a different explanation, but it's very, very likely that the author of that poem was the murder of Cheri Jo Bates. Now, there's a critical detail, though. The poem is signed R.H. Like you can read, just these kind of like little violent things. Oh, she's already wearing a red dress and now she's bleeding and stuff like that. And then the poem is signed R.H. What does that mean? Is that somebody's initials? Well, that's the first kind of instinct that you would have, right, when you see two letters. We've talked a lot about Ross Sullivan. Ross Sullivan is kind of like the prime suspect now in the murder of Cheri Jo Bates. Well, how does that fit in? I had my first instinct, like many people, be what was Ross's middle name or something. So I just Googled Ross Sullivan. I was like, what was his middle name? Well, his middle initials were RMSS. Ross Mercer Stephen Sullivan. So that doesn't exactly fit right there. But then I thought, like, well, let's go through some of the sites. And I found one that provided this enormous timeline. And if I can go back and find the link, I'll post it. But they really just timelined. It was a timeline of not only Ross Sullivan and his birth until his death, but also the events that happened before and after. And you could see some stuff about his parents. Ross Sullivan's father was named Harold, and his mother was named Harriet. Both had names that begin with H. Is that what this sort of is, like Ross Harold or Ross Harriet? Both of his parents had names that began with the letter H. Is that a connection? I don't know. That's just something that I kind of observed. There was another possible theory that was out there, which was sort of saying that R and H could actually mean Riverside Halloween, because remember, Cheri Jo Bates' body was found on the morning of Halloween, October 31st, and someone was like, what this sounds like is this is a call to, well, it's a call to violence. It's like this is kind of like a marker about when they're going to be committing their next murder. And I was just about to say that Cheri Jo Bates went to Riverside High School, but I actually think it's one of those things where you just kind of like it's just slipped your mind. Was it actually called Ramona High School? I mean, like the RH was from Ramona High. That was something that I also thought about, and I think I saw one more comment talking about that, where like they're trying to sort of say that they were targeting somebody from Ramona High. But what I can say is, coming out of kind of reviewing some of the information about Cheri Jo Bates, she doesn't necessarily have to know her attacker. I think we had some reports that Cheri Jo Bates and Ross Sullivan did know each other. But there's another big detail that we have to mention. In this one, like someone in the comments section had been asking, what was the size of the boot print found at the scene? We had a military boot print that was found at the scene, and I believe the police were actually able to identify where it came from. They said that this is a military boot print that is sold in surplus stores. I mean, you can take that for what you want. You can examine that any way you want, but they identified it as the type commonly sold in surplus stores. Ross Sullivan he did wear military boots regularly. The size of the boot print was size 8 to 10 and a half. And I was listening to this one podcast. Well, I guess it was like a vlog, you would say. I want to get the girl's name right. It was True Crime Weirdo. I hope I'm remembering that one correctly. And she said, okay, so we're dealing with some guy who's not super big and not super small. A lot of people have heard things about size 8 to 10, 10 and a half as a boot print, and they think that's too small for Ross Sullivan. He's often described as someone who's a lot bigger. And one guy was on one of the forums leaving this one comment when he was saying that, kind of just trying to give the sort of more obvious statements when he's like, there are some people that are taller, over 6 feet tall, who have small feet. There are some people who are very short who have clown feet that just look huge. Maybe you've known someone in your daily life. I'm 5'8", and I wear a size 10 and a half. I mean, Ross Sullivan seemed like a little bit bigger than that, so some people think that perhaps he was too small for, sorry, he was too big to have left that size 10, size 10 or 10 and a half boot print. They think it's too small for Ross Sullivan. What do you make of that? Or is that just kind of an irrelevant detail? I mean, is that just like something that we don't really need to focus on too much? What I would really like to say is that we have, DNA, fingerprints. I mean, they have the watch, all sorts of physical evidence that will connect somebody to this case. I think those are much more pressing if they could somehow get anything with Ross's DNA and just kind of compare and contrast DNA could completely solve that case, or at the very least, it could exonerate Ross Sullivan, or it could confirm that Ross Sullivan was indeed the murderer. Now, but the whole point is, I mean, that one guy was trying to say just that tall people can have small feet and short people can have big feet. It doesn't necessarily. It's too much to say that because somebody is 6'1" that they can't wear a size 10 and a half. Excuse me, they can't wear a size 10 and a half boot. Although, at the same time, there it is. I would admit that that's a little bit unusual. Now, Ross Sullivan would if we if I if we get this right, he worked in the library. He wasn't just a frequent attendee. He did have sort of like a part-time job in the Riverside City College library. And that would have definitely give him a motive to be there late, locking up and stuff like that. It wouldn't just be like he was kind of just stalking out the scene, but that kind of seems like the impression that they've kind of laid out for us, that Ross would have been, or I shouldn't say Ross, I mean like the perpetrator. We don't know that it was Ross Sullivan 100%. The perpetrator was kind of stalking out Cheri Jo's car, that they would have somehow been able to tamper the lock and turn the ignition onward so that the battery would be drained dead, and then they would have, of course, waited for her to come out. So that sort of means that this was somewhat premeditated, that Cheri Jo was specifically targeted. I read something very interesting, though, about that. If we're going to ask, was this Zodiac? If Cheri Jo was specifically targeted, that is somewhat contrary to the other Zodiac murders. Unless you're entertaining the Louis Myers theory, where he was very familiar with four of the victims. But in the most of the Zodiac theories, the Zodiac was just targeting people whom he was not familiar with. Unless, like you would entertain some of the far out theories. We talk about the possibility that Richard Gaikowski knew Darlene Ferrin, and they had sort of like a kind of, that he had this kind of infatuation with her and he was following her around different places. We looked at that theory, but if Cheri Jo Bates is indeed a Zodiac sort of theory, that means like she was specifically targeted. It wasn't just that they were trying to kill any woman, that they weren't just trying to kill any person. It wasn't just that they were just going after any odd person. If they're actually going to tamper with her car so it won't start, and knock on the window and say, "Come on, let's go for a ride. I'll take you home." That means that they were waiting very specifically for Cheri Jo Bates. And some people were saying that is contrary to the Zodiac setup. Another thing that we can explore with this is one of my first feelings, my absolute first feeling about this case was, is it possible that there was some media coverage around this? Newspaper articles, maybe mentioned on television, but definitely a lot of print media. You can even see the articles posted on the internet yourself. Did the Zodiac killer read about this case and hear about them sending the letter to the police, and then over time the Zodiac learned from this person, and then the Zodiac killer thought, this is going to become a model that I'm going to be using in the future? 3 years later, well, really, it's about 2 years later, because we're going to go from October 30th, 1966, to the first Zodiac murders, December 20th, 1968. So about 2 years later. So the Zodiac then begins to think, well, I'm going to try and do something like this. I'm going to write letters to the police and taunt the police, but I'm going to do it better. I'm going to kind of copy the model of Cheri Jo Bates. I mean, that was definitely my first gut instinct about this, and I saw somebody else posting about this on one of the forums, so I'm not alone there with kind of thinking about that, where it's like, this wasn't necessarily a Zodiac killing. This was just something that the Zodiac had read about in the papers, and then used this as kind of a model, a template, got some bad ideas, in other words, a bad influence to kind of push somebody else to kind of come up with this larger, more elaborate scheme that we now know of as the Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac apparently indirectly confessed to the murder of Cheri Jo Bates, something about a line such as, "You saw my work in Riverside," and something like that, but we don't really necessarily know what to make of that. A lot of people have left comments on the Ross Sullivan uploads that I did, saying that Ross Sullivan is the prime suspect in the murder of Cheri Jo Bates. The Zodiac Killer was somebody else. I mean, I think Ross Sullivan fits a lot of the sort of kind of descriptions, the sort of personality types, the sort of what's the exact word? The profile. Ross Sullivan fits the profile of the Zodiac killer very, very well, but I don't think he fits like an absolute glove. And what I've actually sort of been kind of forced to kind of retract in the past was I said that Louis Myers matched zero physical descriptions of the Zodiac killer. It actually sounds like a lot of people are talking about someone a little bit more similar to Louis Myers over the course of like some of the descriptions, curly brown hair, being a little bit shorter. Definitely, if we're going to be dealing with someone who has a shoe size down to as small as size 8, that could be something. But we're going to keep exploring this. And with the murder of Cheri Jo Bates, I do have to insist it's possible that she knew her attacker, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the case. This could just be somebody who was kind of just targeting her and someone who was just trying to very specifically targeting Cheri Jo Bates. And we've talked about how someone can persuade people to get into a car with them. We also had the case of Zhang Yingying, a Chinese international student in America, who was, just like a lot of people had. There's this video of her getting into a car with a guy, and a lot of people thought, oh, she must be waiting for somebody to pick her up. But no, she was just running late for a meeting, and a guy offered her a ride, and she got in the car with him, and he ended up murdering her. People do things like that. It is not out of the norm. It is not abnormal. It is not unheard of. People will get into cars with a complete stranger. Moreover, it's like it just she does not have to have any sort of definitive physical connection with the perpetrator. But at the same time, there is a report that she did know Ross Sullivan. But what is this RH? Because what is the RH at the bottom of the poem that is carved into the desk at the Riverside City College? I always want to say Riverside Community College. I would say though that if it said RS, then I mean people would obviously think it's Ross Sullivan. So if someone is going to be as cryptic as Ross Sullivan would be, I really doubt he would put his real initials into a desk where he worked. I mean, they would just be like, hey, there's RS carved into a desk, and Ross Sullivan, you work here. We know you did this. Please don't do that again, Mr. Sullivan. Something like that would happen, as well as, of course, probably being forced to pay $75 for a new table. That kind I mean, people don't necessarily just leave their real initials around. Sometimes they come up with cryptic stuff, like perhaps using the name of his father, Ross Harold, or his mother, Ross Harriet, R.H. But that's just some things that we've been throwing out there. I also was watching something from the channel, I hope I get this right, SoCal Urbanix, and they said something about Cheri Jo Bates' murder, so I clicked on it, and it turned out it was just some scenery of the Riverside City College. And like they have said in their description, they just kind of post things about California as a resource, kind of like resource and information stuff. And I was like, I'm glad they posted this because you can really see a lot of things about the Riverside City College and the way the campus looks. And I have to say, it's a very urban campus, RCC, Riverside City College, very urban indeed. And what that tells me is that not a lot of secluded areas. There are a lot of busy streets that are going up and down. And this would have only been about 9 o'clock at night when Cheri Jo would have been coming out of the library. I mean, this is 40 years later on. I'm sure that the town has changed somewhat in 40 years, but it's a very urban campus. Lots and lots of residential houses, though, are right across the street from the from the RCC. And Cheri Jo was actually found in an alley. I believe, like, if we look at the crime scene photos, she's in between a couple houses. The point is, like, this is not like some secluded area. This isn't like a parking lot in the middle of nowhere. This is a very, very kind of urban area, and it's a little bit gutsy. And once again, though, I think that the people who kind of commit these crimes, as we mentioned on the last Zodiac Killer upload, either the Zodiac is somebody who is very good at disguising his appearance by kind of hiding in plain sight with making his appearance look very general, or he is somebody who is just extremely difficult to describe and people just don't notice him that easily. And we're not necessarily sure that Cheri Jo and the Zodiac are connected, but the person like who would have murdered her would definitely have been in kind of plain view for a lot of people, a lot of houses, a lot of busy traffic. It's a very, very kind of urban campus that's going to be surrounded by an enormous amount of other buildings and houses and busy streets. Yet it's just very strange that we don't have more eyewitness stuff going on at only 9 o'clock at night. We're not talking about 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. when you would have less people out on the street. I mean, if she did indeed die at 9:07. So, this really turned out to be one of the longer uploads on this channel, but there's just so much to say about Cheri Jo Bates, and I mean, I wish I could just present you something more definitive saying that yes, this person is the killer or no, this person isn't. In fact, anything, I mean, we've kind of gone through a lot of possibilities. When it comes to a gut feeling, I feel about 87% sure that Ross Sullivan was the murderer of Cheri Jo Bates. 87%. 13% I'm a little bit undecided. We do have the things about the boot print. Might have been a little small for him. Maybe not. I don't know. What do you guys think about that? We also have the possibility about kind of the cryptic meaning of the letters RH. We don't necessarily know if that's a connection to Sullivan, although the handwriting is very similar to the Zodiac killer and the handwriting on the desk, as well as Ross Sullivan's. It's entirely possible. Like I said, 87% I would say Ross Sullivan murdered Cheri Jo Bates. Not to mention Ross's bizarre behavior and his history of mental illness, as well as the Ross was a big fan of military boots, and if he wasn't in the military, he would have purchased them at a military surplus store. All of those things. I really just think DNA would solve this case and we could get a more definitive answer. Not to mention, we have the report of Ross Sullivan driving a Volkswagen Bug, Cheri Jo Bates driving a Volkswagen Bug, and Todd K left another excellent comment about how this is a very frequent model of car. But if we know that Ross had one, he probably would have known some way that he could have run the battery out. He would have known how to turn that ignition in a certain way. So I mean, I wish I had more to say about this, and I think that maybe we could get some very definitive answers about Cheri Jo Bates if we do a few more uploads. But anyway, thank you so much for listening to this. If you've made it all the way to the end, if you have anything to share at all, please drop a comment below. If you like this upload, you can hit the like button. But most importantly, please drop some comments so we can expand the discussion. And some sources that I really recommend, zodiacciphers.net, zodiacciphers.com, and we talked about Zodiac Killer Identified, did a nice presentation on Cheri Jo Bates with primary sources. SoCal UrbanX had that good presentation on the Riverside City College. And I also saw that one from True Crime Weirdo, I believe is her name, her YouTube name. Although I could only watch about 60 seconds of her upload when she shared some good things, but a lot of background noise in that one. Anyway, thank you so much to